right. Ever think about what happens when elections, those things um, clash with how the Philippines runs its electric companies?
Yeah.
Like, can someone running for mayor also, keep their job at the electric company?
Oh, yeah, I see what you're saying.
It's a question of like, where does one job end and the other begin, all right? And that's exactly what we're going to be diving into today with a case that, well, it went all the way up to the Supreme Court in the Philippines.
Oh, wow, all the way to the top.
Yeah, it's a fascinating one. And it's officially titled, let me get this right, National Electrification Administration versus Oscar C. Borja and Venancio B. Regulado.
Okay.
Case number GR-No 232581. And it was decided on November 13th, 2024. So fairly recent.
Interesting.
Yeah. So we're going to break down the facts, how it went through the courts,
Yeah.
all the twists and turns, and of course get to what the Supreme Court ultimately decided.
Okay, sounds good.
So to start, this case is about two guys, Oscar Borja and Venancio Regulado. And back in 2013, they were both on the board of an electric cooperative. Quezerico 2, it was called.
Oh, okay.
And both of them, get this,
Sure.
decided to run for local office.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, Borja for mayor and Regulado, he went for municipal councilor.
So both wanted to be politicians.
Exactly. Seems pretty, normal so far. Right?
Yeah, I don't see the issue yet.
Well, that's where the National Electrification Administration, or NEA, they stepped in.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, and they were pointing to this memorandum they put out in 2012, basically saying, if you work for an electric cooperative and you decide to run for any office, doesn't matter if it's local or national, you got to resign.
Ah, so that's where the conflict is.
Yeah, basically the NEA was telling Borja and Regulado, hey, you got to pick running for office or your jobs at Quezerico 2.
So they couldn't do both.
Nope.
Yeah.
And, well, as you can imagine, that didn't sit well, and that's how this whole legal battle began. This thing went through the entire Philippine court system.
Yeah. Wow. They didn't give up easily.
No, they did not. So, first stop, the Regional Trial Court, the RTC.
Okay.
And initially, they sided with the NEA, even issued a temporary restraining order to stop Borja and Regulado from, well, doing their jobs at Quezerico 2.
So round one to the NEA?
Yeah, you could say that.
Yeah.
But then here's where it gets interesting. The RTC actually reversed its decision.
Really?
Yeah, they basically said the NEA memorandum was unconstitutional. So naturally, that led to an appeal, sending the case up to the Court of Appeals.
I see. So up the ladder it goes.
Exactly, a real legal tug-of-war. But the Court of Appeals didn't actually give a clear ruling. It went all the way up to the Supreme Court.
So the Supreme Court had the final say.
Yes, they did. And the big question for them, right, was did the NEA actually have the power to force these guys to resign?
Right.
Like, was that memo even legal? They had to look at if it matched up with the NEA's own charter, their rule book,
Right.
and the Omnibus Election Code, which basically governs all elections in the Philippines.
Oh, so a lot of legal stuff to consider.
You got it. So what did the Supreme Court decide? Well, they actually sided with Borja and Regulado. They said, nope, NEA, you can't force these guys to resign just because they want to run for office.
Wow, interesting. So why'd they decide that?
Well, one big thing was that they said that even though the NEA regulates electric cooperatives, they're essentially private entities.
Oh, okay. So the NEA doesn't have complete control.
Exactly. The Supreme Court was like, hey, NEA, you can't just do whatever you want. They even referenced a past case, Quinton v. Comlec. Basically, it said that, administrative issuances like that NEA memorandum can't overrule existing laws.
Right. Makes sense.
But here's the thing, right? By the time this got to the Supreme Court, Borja and Regulado's terms at Quezerico 2 were over.
Oh, so the case was already irrelevant.
Yeah, technically it was moot, no practical impact anymore.
So what happened then?
Well, that's where things get even more interesting.
Yeah.
They decided to use this case to, set a precedent, even though the situation, was already resolved.
Yeah, to give some guidance for the future.
Exactly. So that, things are clear if this kind of situation comes up again. But speaking of, all this, it makes me think about electric cooperatives in the Philippines. What's their deal?
Oh, they're really important, especially in those rural areas. You see, in the cities, you've got those big private power companies, but out in the country, a lot of communities rely on these cooperatives for their electricity.
So they're kind of like what, community-owned utilities?
Yeah, that's a good way to put it. They're owned by the members, they're not for profit, and the people who run them, the board, they're elected by the members.
Oh, I see. So this case is about, who gets to make those decisions that affect the whole community?
Right. It's about how those cooperatives are run.
And by siding with Borja and Regulado, the Supreme Court basically said that these cooperatives have the right to govern themselves, right?
Exactly. They said, look, these communities should be able to control their own electricity without the national government stepping in.
Which goes back to that whole ultravirus thing you mentioned earlier, right?
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, it does. Remember, ultra vires means doing something you don't have the legal power to do. And the Supreme Court said the NEA's memorandum was ultra vires because it overstepped its boundaries.
Like they were trying to do too much.
Right. And this principle, it's not just about electric cooperatives, it's about protecting any private organization, even if the government regulates them.
So it's like setting limits on government power.
Exactly. But, all of this makes you realize just how important those electric cooperatives are in the Philippines. Their boards must have a lot of influence.
Yeah, I mean, they're deciding on things like rates and building new infrastructure and, well, basically everything about how people get their electricity.
And who gets to be on those boards? Well, that's a big deal for those communities.
And I guess it makes sense that someone might want to be on the board of a cooperative and then, maybe run for mayor or something later.
Yeah, it's a pretty common path. And this ruling means they don't have to choose between the two. They can serve their community through the cooperative and run for office.
So it's like good for democracy, more people getting involved.
Yeah, more representation, more participation. It's a good thing.
But I gotta say, this case is just so interesting. It's like law and politics and how communities work all mixed together.
It really shows how these legal decisions can affect how our society runs, even the technical ones.
But before we move on, let's take a quick break to hear from our sponsors. Okay, so we're back and ready to wrap up our deep dive into this whole electric cooperative and election law situation in the Philippines.
Definitely. It's been a fascinating one.
Yeah, we've covered like the facts of the case, how those cooperatives work, even how the legal system in the Philippines is set up. But there's one more thing we got to talk about.
Okay, what's that?
Mootness.
Ah, yeah, mootness. It can be a bit of a tricky concept.
It is. Like, why would the Supreme Court even bother making a decision if the case is essentially, over? Like, it doesn't affect those guys anymore.
Right, Borja and Regulado, their terms are done.
Exactly. So why not just say, case closed, nothing to see here?
Well, because courts aren't just there to settle individual disputes. They also have to, clarify the law for everyone.
So it's about more than just those two guys.
Right. Sometimes even a moot case can teach us something important about the law, something that might come up again later.
So it's like the Supreme Court saw this as a chance to, like, set things straight for the future, even though the specific situation was resolved.
Exactly. They realized this question about the NEA and forcing people to resign, well, it could happen again.
And they wanted to make sure it's handled correctly next time.
Right. No more confusion.
So by making a ruling, even though the case was moot, they basically created a rule book for how to deal with this kind of situation.
Yeah, a guide for the future.
And it shows that legal rulings can have like ripple effects. It's
Yeah.
not just about the immediate case.
Absolutely. And that's why understanding mootness is important. It tells us something about how courts work, how they shape the law for everyone.
Well, this has been a really eye-opening deep dive. We've gone deep into a legal case, learned about electric cooperatives, and even, explored the legal system in the Philippines.
It's been a pleasure breaking all of this down with you. It's always fascinating to see how these legal issues play out and what they mean for the bigger picture.
I totally agree. And for everyone listening, we hope you found this deep dive as interesting as we did. And if you want to explore more fascinating legal cases and what they teach us, well, make sure you subscribe to our channel for more deep dives into the world of law and how it shapes our society. Until next time, stay curious and stay informed.